My log cabin quilts have always been super popular on my channel, but this time let's make a more traditional, scrappy style using a jelly roll instead. Now for this pattern, I am using Timber by Sweetwater from Moda Fabrics. Now with each jelly roll, 2.5-inch strip, you're going to cut two 2.5-inch squares, two 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles, two 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangles, and lastly, one 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle per each strip. If you prefer, you can keep your jelly roll strip folded in half just to save some time with cutting. Otherwise, you will have some scraps left over, so go ahead and save that for another quilt project later. Now you'll just repeat this to all 42 jelly roll 2.5-inch strips. But once everything is cut, it is time to select your prints for your quilt block. So first up, we are going to select one 2.5-inch square. Then in a different print, you're going to select one 2.5-inch square and one 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle. Next, in a different print, you're going to select one 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle and one 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle. Then lastly, once again, but in a fourth print, you're going to select one 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle, and lastly, one 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle. Now it's time to sew everything together. So we are going to start by taking our 2.5-inch square blocks and we are going to sew them together. Then you will take the top and the matching 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle and sew it to the top of the unit that you just created. Now we are going to sew the third print in a 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangle to the left side of the unit, followed by the matching 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle to the top of your unit. Then for the last row, you are going to sew your fourth print in a 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch rectangle to the left side, and then followed by the matching 2.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle to the top of your now completed block. So now you'll just have to repeat these steps until you've made a total of 42 8.5-inch square. Now, one side note, if you are a beginner, I highly recommend that you try my layer cake log cabin quilt pattern, which I will have linked down below in the description. This jelly roll log cabin pattern is more of a confident beginner to an intermediate level. But once all of your blocks are made, you're going to lay them out in a 6 by 7 block layout while rotating each block 90 degrees. Then, as always, sew your blocks together to form rows, and then lastly, sew those rows together to complete your quilt top. And here is what my jelly roll log cabin quilt pattern looks like all finished. And for the backing, I am using this brushstroke print in black. And then for the thread choice, I am going with glide thread in the color Willow. And here's what my quilt looks like all quilted out. And I have selected to use my personal edge-to-edge quilt pattern called Oh Dear, which I will have linked down below in the description. And one 42 count jelly roll will yield you a 48-inch by 56-inch quilt. Two jelly rolls with a 8 by 10 block layout will yield you a twin size quilt measuring 64-inch by 80 inches, just to give you a few more options. Now, I do hope you have enjoyed today's tutorial. If you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.